This week, I'll be spending more time in the golden age of Hollywood. These are the kind of films you might find on TV late night on TCM, though I guess I'm not really the one to ask because I don't watch live TV myself. I haven't in years, other than the Oscars, really. I only know what my dad tells me over the phone that he's watching on TCM, so I'm just assuming. Without further ado, let's just dive back in.
100 degrees of Kevin Bacon under the Kevin Bacon rabbit hole.
Taking off from our previous film, My Man Godfrey, I'm moving on with Carole Lombard into one of Alfred Hitchcock's few American comedies, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. And no, this has nothing to do with that Brangelina one, other than perhaps a vaguely similar thematic connection of a married couple in competition with each other.
I've always had a suspicion about you. So did my mother. Your forehead slants back too much.
Will you please let me say...
Don't touch me.
But, Annie,
Get out of here. Go on, you're not staying here.
We can't leave the bedroom until after we've made up.
You're not in the bedroom. Get out.
Annie, listen to me.
Anne and David Smith are a bit of an idiosyncratic New York couple. As an example of what I mean, the film starts with a spat where it's revealed that they choose to literally lock themselves in their bedroom for sometimes days on end until they resolve their arguments. Even though their relationship appears deep and strong, when Anne asks David if he had to do it all over again, would he marry her again? David gives a surprising answer. Though he's happy with their marriage, he probably wouldn't, because trading his freedom may not seem worth it to him in another hypothetical scenario. Well, guess what? Foreshadowing be damned if that conversation wasn't a huge tip-off, because later the very same day, a county official from Idaho, where their marriage took place 3 years prior, informed them that because of a mix-up with the jurisdiction of their wedding location, they technically were not in a legally bound marriage. After getting into another argument, Anne and David decide to not get married again, or officiate their marriage for real, however you want to look at it, and the rest of the film sort of becomes a passive-aggressive contest between the couple. Probably my favorite scene is where they unexpectedly see each other from across a restaurant, and as an attempt to fan jealousy, David decides to mime as if he's happily speaking to a date next to him who's not really his date.
She's rather pretty, isn't she? Do you know her, Jack?
No, I don't.
Couple interesting bits of trivia. It turns out that sadly this was one of the last films featuring Carole Lombard before she tragically died in a plane crash. It's apparently one of the earliest films to ever show a pizzeria, and Hitchcock also attempted to get a toilet flushing in this film, but this odd taboo was censored, and Hitch would again fight a similar battle with the censors a couple decades later while shooting Psycho. And that time he won the toilet battle, since it was the first time in cinema history where a toilet was flushed, much less featured on screen. Anyways, as far as Hitchcock films go, this one doesn't make it into the upper echelon for me. It's got some funny moments and it's a compelling idea, but overall, it's not especially memorable. Hitchcock himself apparently wasn't very happy with the result either. So if you're looking for a, quote, Hitchcock film, you'll probably be especially disappointed because this is devoid of almost all of his classic trademarks. It's by no means a complete dud. There are some really funny moments and there's some charm to it, but when it comes to screwball comedies, there's just much better material out there. I've crossed paths with Robert Montgomery's name a couple times before, but now that I have a face, I'm going to choose it. On to Night Must Fall.
I thought you said something about a murder.
Oh, lot of nonsense.
Well, we don't know, of course, but there might have been a murder, mightn't there?
Oh, yes, there might have been a murder. Yes.
This is based on a play by writer Emlyn Williams and takes place mostly in a home owned by Mrs. Bramson, played by Dame May Whitty, who's an elderly, curmudgeonly woman in a small English village. Mrs. Bramson doesn't seem like warm company. She's a bit bossy with her servants, though we do get the impression that she also has a softer side. One day, a detective shows up and reports that a local woman has gone missing, and they begin questioning everybody in the house. This is where things start to pick up a little bit. There's a lot of interconnecting relationships between the characters, and I won't bore you too much with the details, but the boyfriend of the maid Dora, Danny, played by Robert Montgomery, shows up and appears to charm the hell out of Mrs. Bramson. I have to say something about Dora, though. She's meant to be a sympathetic character, but her high Cockney voice I found to be, I don't know, just kind of creepy, so it gave me some weird vibes. I mean, it could totally be sampled on a deathcore album, don't you think?
I did dream of spiders last night. Hundreds of them.
As for Danny, he's a pretty damn suspicious dude from the get-go. For example, when entering the home by himself, he nonchalantly throws the cat away from him, whereas later in the company of others he mentions that he loves animals and asks to hold the very same cat. Hint, 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 hint. You may have noticed in a couple of my previous reviews that I tend to feel a bit frustrated when certain films lack subtlety, and I think I'm figuring out why based around situations like these. Because rather than build suspense and tension, it sort of telegraphs signals too obviously. Part of what makes great films satisfying to watch is that we have to do a little bit of work in our own minds to piece things together. But when there's a map showing you where all the pieces are supposed to go, it can feel a little insulting to your intelligence. And that's kind of what's going on here. I mean, we get it. Danny is probably kind of bad. The only person who seems to really have their suspicions is Mrs. Bramson's niece, Olivia, with whom Danny seems to take a fancy to. Anyways, I won't say too much more about the plot other than the fact that I found the ending to be just way too obvious. I was waiting for the ends of this film to justify its means, but ultimately it just fell prey to predictability. This is the type of suspense tale that could have been a slam dunk in the hands of Hitchcock, but in the hands of director Richard Thorpe it was just kinda meh. Perhaps I'm also so immersed in the psychological thriller as a staple of modern filmmaking especially, the study this film puts forth, it's no David Fincher. And I can never help but compare the psychological thrillers of yore to Fritz Lang's M, which came out just a handful of years prior, and in my mind is probably the greatest thriller ever made. Lang is a giant of cinema, so maybe that's unfair, but the point is, I know that the potential to make effective films within this genre was strongly present in this era. In the end, despite some decent performances from Robert Montgomery and Rosalind Russell, I just think this film stopped a little short of its potential. Though in its day it was a critical success, and it does have its moments, I don't consider it a tragedy that this film seems to be largely forgotten. Dame Mae Whitty, incidentally one of the first ever female entertainers to achieve status as Dame, was an English actress who first made a name for herself on the London stage all the way back in the 1890s. I'm going to follow her on to another one of her later roles in My Name is Julia Ross.
You live in the village, don't you? Then help me. I'm not his wife. I don't know what's happening or why. But please, call the police, call someone. Help me.
Well, of course Alice will help you. We'll all help you now. Just have your tea.
In this gothic noir, Nina Falk plays Julia Ross, a young woman who's desperate for work and manages to land a gig as a live-in personal secretary for a wealthy widow, Mrs. Hughes, played by Mae Whitty. However, something seems fishy early on about the whole situation, at least to us viewers, since we become privy to a conversation where the people who plan on employing her only do so because they realize that she has no close relatives. One morning, Julia wakes up in the mansion, only to realize that all of her possessions are gone, and everybody insists that she isn't Julia, but rather a woman named Marion, who happens to be the wife of Mrs. Hughes' son, Ralph. Julia begins seeing strange shadows and other creepy things that seem to insinuate that she may not be sane. But given the amount of exposition she, and we as the audience overhear, it's soon clear that she's just a prisoner of a mysterious situation. The plot reminds me a little bit of Gaslight, which is where the term gaslighting originated, referring to psychological manipulation of a female. Also, hey, holy shit, look who's in both films! The main difference is, in Gaslight, a sane woman is repeatedly led to believe she's hysterical and delusional, whereas here in this film, the protagonist is perfectly grasping onto her sanity despite the pretense that this family is attempting to shove down her throat. The synopsis I first saw described this film as a low-budget B-movie, but this does not feel like it's suffering in quality of production in the same way that most stereotypical B-movies did. It builds the atmosphere pretty well, there is some effectively suspenseful camera work, and honestly I'm a little bit of a sucker for gothic settings. The first half of the film I think is pretty strong overall, but in my opinion it kinda goes a little off the rails. I found Falk's performance to be a little too melodramatic. There's one sequence where she has kind of an outburst that just felt a bit over the top.
There isn't much they don't know about my little wife.
But there's one thing you don't know. The police will be here today, and you'd better see to it that I'm all right when they come.
You mean because of this note?
And hence the seams of the B-movie status show. There is one twist later on that's almost worth a gasp, but it doesn't really enrich the story beyond a momentary shock at best. By the end, the threads of this plot get tied up just a little too neatly. With a bit more boldness in the writing, I think this could have been a great thriller, but the final act is a little bit rushed and they didn't really stick the landing. However, for the film's atmosphere and the handful of suspenseful scenes it does pull off, I think it's a decent noir overall. Also, having a breezy 64-minute runtime almost makes it feel like a solid episode of crime television. I mean, if you watch any crime stuff on HBO, Sopranos, The Wire, True Detective, I'm sure you've seen episodes longer than this, right? Prior to the previous film, I only knew George McCready as that asshole general from Paths of Glory, so let's see what else he's done.
Thank you. The court is allowing you $3,000 a month until the probate is completed. And by the way, Frank bequeathed $50,000 to your sister, Edith.
50,000 to Edith.
Dead Ringer follows Edith Phillips, who reunites with her twin sister Margaret after the funeral of Margaret's wealthy husband Frank DeLorca. The sisters haven't seen each other for almost 20 years, and it's apparent from their discussion that grudges between them are still strong. Not long after their reunion, a confrontation between the two ends in Margaret's death at the hands of her sister, who stages her death as a suicide. Following this incident, Edith takes every step to cover her tracks and switch places with her sister, for whom she's shown powerful disdain and envy. However, Edith soon realizes that this deception isn't as sustainable as she believed it would be. Suspicions arise from former close friends and acquaintances, which begin to radically endanger her whole ruse. To top it off, Edith eventually discovers some devious things about her twin sister that puts her in an even more delicate situation, having to bear burdens she was previously unaware existed. This is the second time Bette Davis has performed as twins. This is in fact often mistakenly considered a remake of A Stolen Life. But other than Davis performing the twin gimmick in both, the two films are unrelated. This is, however, essentially a remake of the 1946 Mexican film La Otra, starring Dolores Del Rio. Now, I have not actually watched Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, an iconic role that Davis is known for around the same time, but I could tell that there are strong parallels. And this poster? A little on the nose, don't you think? But hey, if the marketing works, I guess. The cinematography, I have to say, is pretty sophisticated. The DeLorca mansion has a beautiful gothic vibe. Seems like that's almost a theme this week, eh? There are some pretty impressive sequences with the sisters doubled in the same frame. It's easy to get away with these tricks in recent decades with computers and whatnot, but this had me just struggling to understand how certain shots were pulled off since it wasn't apparent that any kind of matte or chroma key was used. I'm usually able to identify the seams of the film, and nothing really stuck out to me here. Cinematographer Ernest Haller apparently really knew his stuff, and I guess he borrowed the same technique he used from A Stolen Life here as well. Now, as for what his method is, I was unable to find out specifically. I'm not sure if Haller was hush-hush about his methods or if it's just difficult to dig up, but it's a mystery I'd love to solve myself at some point. In the realm of shortcomings, there was really just one major distraction for me: the scene where a suicide is staged. The logistics of it struck me as a little bit silly. I don't want to go into too much detail other than saying a point-blank shot from a pistol would probably do way more damage than what we saw on screen. I mean, you'd probably expect at least a few drops of blood, am I right? The story has a conclusion that kind of makes you go, oh snap! I mean, maybe, if you're like me at all, that is. It's not a crazy twist or anything, but it's a neat little bow on the whole package. All in all, this is a solid thriller. It doesn't shatter any major barriers or cement itself as a paragon of anything in particular, outside of the technical stunts I mentioned, but it's one that's well worth your 2 hours if you're into classic dramatic thrillers. Bette Davis is another old Hollywood actress with whose work I'm embarrassingly unfamiliar, so I'll move on to one of her more iconic performances in All About Eve.
If my guests do not like it here, I suggest they accompany you to the nursery, where I'm sure you will all feel more at home.
Davis stars as Margot Channing, a legendary Broadway star who seems to be nearing the end of her prime. Eve Harrington is an ambitious young aspiring actress who gets the privilege of meeting her hero and is even recruited by Channing to be her personal assistant. At first, it's not really all about Eve. Margot is getting most of the spotlight, but much like any washed-up career artist in these stories, we see her character begin to descend into drunkenness, paranoia, and bitterness. Eve comes off as a starry-eyed and ambitious, but probably naive young ingenue, but proves to have a strong work ethic and earns Margot's trust and affection for the most part. However, as Eve begins to build an acting career for herself, at one point sneaking her way into being Margot's understudy for a major role, tensions begin to peak. Eventually, Margot's spotlight fades and the attention shifts to Eve, who proves herself to be even more of a flawed, brash, and deceitful character than Margot was. A lot of the film is told in the POV of Addison DeWitt, a journalist played by George Sanders, and honestly, he's my favorite part of the whole film. He does what journalists should do best, which is expose powers that go awry. The story weaved shows a clear cycle of traits that are passed on through ambitious types who compromise their humanity for their career. It's a familiar yet thematically important concept, and many have over the years commented on some homoerotic overtones here, which I think are subtle enough for one to be suspicious of their presence at all. So all in all, there are many reasons that this film has a reputation, but I'm at high risk for being ostracized by the film buff community for my opinion, but I'm just not a fan. Judging by general consensus, I'm definitely in the minority here, but I found the film to be tedious and uninteresting. To me, it's just way too long. The pacing is often grueling, and at a certain point it just feels like a catty contest of bratty thespians, which I found to be a massive turnoff. Though in all fairness, I think this is where context matters. This was an era when the washed-up actress trope was something far fresher to its audience than it is to our modern eyes, which are now oversaturated with navel-gazing stories of how show business always does the old chew up and spit out to career actors. It's important to acknowledge, though, that Bette Davis, though I highly dislike her character, gives a strong performance. I understand that many find this film engaging and poignant, but when it comes to old Hollywood indictments about the cruelty towards and by veteran actresses, I think I'll stick with Sunset Boulevard. Anne Baxter has never really been on my radar. She did a fine job in All About Eve, though, so I'm going to use her to check some Orson Welles off my list.
What did you say, George?
I said automobiles are a useless nuisance. Never amount to anything but a nuisance, and they had no business to be invented.
Of course, you forget Mr. Morgan makes them. Also did he share in inventing them. If you weren't so thoughtless, he might think you rather offensive.
Soon on the heels of making what many consider the greatest film of all time, Citizen Kane, Orson Welles jumps into a different period with the magnificent Ambersons, which takes place in the late 19th century. The Ambersons are a wealthy Midwestern family, and the film primarily focuses on how the changing times affect their estate and their family. One of the main characters outside the family is Eugene Morgan, who becomes infatuated with Isabel Amberson, and the two share love from a young age. Although things don't really work out for them, and Isabel marries a rather boring fellow, resulting in the birth of George, whom we learn at the very start of the film is a spoiled brat through and through. Jumping ahead a couple decades, Gene turns out to be a co-inventor and primary investor in the automobile in its early stages. George takes an instant dislike to his mother's former lover and just acts like a dick to him pretty much all the time. He does, however, have quite the thing for Gene's daughter Lucy, and this is not something he can just let go of. Eventually, Isabel and her family have to deal with the passing of her husband Wilbur and the financial decline that hits the family due to his bad investments following him soon before his death. The rest of the film weaves through a series of years where the Ambersons and the Morgans have to cope with their tensions and mutual emerging hardships. What we specifically see through this is a swift maturation of George Amberson. He doesn't soften overnight by any means, but his tribulations force him to make some very difficult decisions. From the first frames, if you're film literate, you'll notice some immediate technical similarities to Citizen Kane. Soft vignette edges during flashbacks, expository voiceover by Mr. Welles himself. In fact, this might be one of the most brilliant voiceovers I've heard in a while. Whereas most disembodied voiceovers you're probably familiar with are purposefully stilted and matter-of-fact, Orson Welles has a marvelously acted and heartfelt performance as he narrates the story.
And now it came at last. George Amberson Miniford had got his comeuppance. He got it 3 times filled and running over.
There's also camera work that's subtly sophisticated, lighting that is stylized, which highlights the immaculate set backgrounds, multi-layered shadows, sometimes darkening the entire foreground, and art direction that makes it feel like a filmic tapestry. When it comes to performances, everybody here is bringing their A game, but Agnes Moorehead, who plays Fanny, George's aunt, was the performance that really stuck out with me.
Get up, Aunt Fanny.
It's not hot, it's cold. The plumber's disconnected. I wouldn't mind if they hadn't. I wouldn't mind if it burned. I wouldn't mind if it burned me, George!
Oh, Andy, for God's sake, get up! Now stop it!
This film is very good, but there was something about it that didn't quite sit right with me by the end. Sort of like it was missing pieces or that entire sequences were completely omitted. And doing a little research confirmed my suspicions. Orson Welles often had to fight the studios tooth and nail to fulfill his vision the way he wanted. And this was a battle he seems to have lost. This film apparently has over an entire hour missing from Welles' original cut, and it makes me very curious to see his original version, which sadly it seems is mostly lost. This was clearly meant to be a sweeping epic, but the studio was chopping it into the diet version of its original hearty content. The most glaring indication of this for me was how the ending, as it is, feels abrupt, unnaturally optimistic, and honestly a bit tagged on, since it leaves a couple of important plot pieces unresolved. That being said, the strengths radically outweigh the flaws, and despite the fact that it feels a bit butchered, it's not hard to see why this film is often celebrated as one of Welles' very best. Thanks again for watching another episode in my little series here. Remember to like, subscribe, the usual blah blah blah. Remember to spread the word to other movie nerds. And I'll see you next week. Toodles. Release the Welles cut!